West is said to be, fundamentally a bad thing, being white-skinned. Consequently, it had to be undermined and replaced by the... We're all living in a world of imagine, where there are no divisions and nothing to fight or die for, but we have created divisions. This is the paradox. Well, no, actually, universal human rights creates groups that fight each other for power and identify themselves as victims and as good and virtuous because they're victims, as opposed to other groups who are oppressors. What I feel is what is, as Oprah famously said, I have my truth, you have your truth. If you have no truth, you have no lies. Well, the idea that the United Nations stands for peace and justice is a sick joke. They're flirting with the idea of criminalising Islamophobia. And of course one can't talk about that because it's Islamophobic. Question is it a done deal?
Thank you very much.
Is the West just going off the edge of the cultural cliff?
Mel Phillips, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Very good to see you.
It's very good to see you. Is the West on the verge of collapse?
Well, it's certainly not looking too healthy. It seems to have a kind of death wish. I mean, for decades, its leading light, its intelligentsia, has been taking a kind of wrecking ball to its core institutions and its core values, on the basis that very explicitly that the West is said to be, fundamentally a bad thing. It was allegedly born in the original sins of colonialism and racism and exploitation and being white-skinned. And consequently, it had to be kind of undermined and replaced by the brave new world of the brotherhood of man, international law, international human rights, international transnational institutions, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, sainted European Union, and so on and so forth. This has had a tremendous effect, and I think it has absolutely eroded the West to the point that the West, quite self-evidently now, does not wish to and doesn't have the means to defend itself against outside predators, outside enemies. It's let its defences wither away. Partly because, it's wanted to spend its money on, welfare stuff, but also because I think it's a culture which has basically totally assimilated the famous lyric of John Lennon, nothing to fight or die for. We're all living in a world of imagine, where there are no divisions and nothing to fight or die for, but we have created divisions. This is the paradox. On the basis that the nation is the source of all bad things. It's the source of prejudice and war and conflict because it's exclusive, because it is itself a nation, it's particularist, and consequently is separate from other similar nations. That was a bad thing because that created division. And so we have this universalist philosophy based on human rights, the individual, what I'm entitled to. And that's supposed to produce a brave new world without prejudice or conflict. But in fact, what it's produced, because it's a rights-based culture, it's produced a society which is no longer a society. It's actually a confederation of competing groups, groups set up to issue demands for their rights, groups that identify in various ways and identify themselves as victims and as good and virtuous because they're victims, as opposed to other groups who are oppressors. And so what we've got is a kind of fight for power all the time. We've also got a complete collapse of moral reasoning and reasoning itself. We, the West, told ourselves, or rather our intellectual elites told us decades ago, there was no such thing as objective truth. Anyone who believed in objective truth was basically a cretin. It was so unsophisticated. Anybody with any intelligence knew that there was only opinion and everything was relative. What I feel is what is, as Oprah famously said, I have my truth, you have your truth.
That's Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah Winfrey, yes.
Just for anyone. Is it opera? I thought Oprah.
Well, it's probably Oprah. I don't know. I probably get these things wrong.
Yeah. We'll have our own truths about the pronunciation.
Well, yes, we can all have our own morally relativist pronunciation. And what I feel trumps any facts, because feelings, the subjective trumps the objective. Now, if you have no truth, you have no lies. If there's no truth, you can't have lies. So you don't know the difference between truth and lies. Indeed, there can be no difference between truth and lies. Everything's a matter of opinion. So you have a society which has become very gullible to lies, very credulous to lies. And if you have no truth and you don't know the difference between truth and lies, you can't have reason. And if you can't have reason, you can't have rationality. And I think we have destroyed rationality. So, it's a paradox. We're such a rational society, apparently, that we have basically declared God dead and religion is stupid. And there's no such thing as objective truth, and people who believe in that are cretins. We're so rational that we've got rid of rationality completely, because you can't have rationality without truth. And people are believing all kinds of extraordinary things. I mean, the idea that religious belief has gone out the window and in its place has come, the high moral ground of the intellect. I mean, one of the fastest growing things at the moment is witchcraft. People are becoming pagan and they're worshipping inanimate objects. And they're into all kinds of stuff like parapsychology, Eastern religions, which are, I'm sure people can live exactly as they want to live, but the idea that that's rational is the opposite of the truth. So all these things, conscience, reason, justice, to me, these are the core, or three of the most important core values of what we call Western civilization, which I think is actually civilization. These are civilized values. And I think they've all been undermined to the point of extinction. The question is, and this is what I try and grapple with in my book, is it a done deal? Is it now all over? Is the West just going off the edge of the cultural cliff? And many people think it is. People think it's gone far too far. We've destroyed the traditional family. We've destroyed the education system as a means of transmitting the culture, because we've told ourselves the culture is too awful to be transmitted. We've destroyed the idea of the nation. So we've destroyed what is basically is the essential building blocks of the culture. So there's no going back. Well, I think there's always going back. I think it's not over till it's over. I draw great comfort from the fact that there are millions and millions of people who self-evidently, demonstrably, are voting, in a way, politically voting, against an entire political establishment. This is across Britain and Europe, against an entire political establishment which has connived at all this. And we may not like who is being thrown up in terms of political leadership. That's not the point. There is this, what's bringing them to power is this resistance among millions of people. So that gives me great heart. And also, as I try and say in the book, I think a lot of people are just waiting for the right kind of leadership to fill a kind of spiritual void and a spiritual vacuum, and people are unhappy. We have a record rates of mental, psychological stress, especially among young people. And to me, a lot of that is to do with meaninglessness, the feeling that, we are kind of random specks in the universe whirling through an infinite nothing. And that's pretty depressing.
Yeah.
And people don't have a sense of purpose. They don't have challenges that mean that they have to overcome them, which is what gives us a sense of purpose, and so on and so on. And so actually, I think there's everything to play for, and I kind of set out a little kind of action program, which I think can actually help.
It's a wonderful and fascinating book, and it made me think about so many things. And one of them you were just touching on, I think, because there's this meaninglessness that we speak of. I know you were on Winston Marshall's show. Winston, I believe, is a Christian. I'm an atheist. I can't tell from your book because I think you obviously deliberately don't pick a side. Is that fair?
Correct.
But the dividing line today, I mean, that might have been the dividing line 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So what is the dividing line today?
Right. Well, glad you made that point, because it's a very important point that I've tried to make in the book. In the past, we told ourselves there were certain dividing lines, and I think these dividing lines now, if they were ever valid, are now completely irrelevant. The dividing lines I'm thinking of are, for example, left versus right. men versus women, black versus white, gay versus straight, and then religious versus atheist, and then within the religious dimension, Jews versus Christians, or Christians versus Jews, and Jews and Christians versus Muslims, and everybody else versus everybody else. Okay, I don't think that works anymore at all. I think the real dividing line is between the people in every one of those groups who actually really values the West and values the values of the West and wants the West to continue because they want to live like that. And they're in all those groups. And the people in all those groups who really hate the West and want it gone and replaced by something else. And there are a lot of those too. Now, the people who are in the first group who want the West to continue, I've said in the book, I think should basically somehow get together under the right kind of leadership and form what I call a kind of counter-cultural resistance, a coalition for civilization. And it would bring together everybody, people of all faiths and none, so you would certainly be included, and people from all different cultures and identity groups and so on. But the crucial thing is this, that if they wish to, if they value what the West is associated with historically and traditionally, and they want that to continue, then they have to accept that those values didn't just spring from nowhere. They're not imprinted in our DNA. Most societies in the world don't have them. They are particular to the West, and they come from two particular creeds, the Christianity, which is the kind of foundational, institutional creed of the West. And here's the thing that surprises people. Christianity itself rests on Judaism, and the values that people think are sacrosanct, if I can use that word, even people who are atheists, for example, respect for everyone, for every human life, for every human being, treating people well as a result, a belief in moral responsibility, taking responsibility for your actions and taking the consequences, a belief that you put others first, so you build community, a belief in justice and the rule of law, and so on and so forth. And the rule of law, by the way, founded in the consent of the people, which is what lies behind democracy. All those things were invented as a revolutionary creed by Judaism. People don't realize that. People don't realize that the rule of law based in the consent of the people is actually a Jewish thing in the Mosaic codes. Now, it's not particularly relevant to anything except that we're in a society which is quite self-consciously got rid of religion and replaced it by secular ideologies, which I think have produced the opposite of all those good things. So this alliance for civilization, this coalition for civilization that I would like to see from people of all creeds and groups and so on, would have to sign up to that, because that's otherwise they're not defending what the West is. If they think, oh yeah, we're gonna fight for the West and we're gonna fight for universal human rights because that's a key Western thing. Well, no, actually, universal human rights creates groups that fight each other for power and creates individualism, which is basically self-centered and inimical to community and communal bonds. So we need to actually say, that was a terrible wrong turning. Sounds nice.
Universal human rights.
Yes.
It does sound nice.
Yes. But I think it's, so people, when they hear this, they say, oh, so she's against rights. So she's basically a kind of totalitarian fascist. Well, this is so stupid, I'm afraid, because what we think of as rights is incoherent unless it's within the context of duties. If I claim a right, who am I claiming it from? The state? Well, good luck with that one. You? Well, why should you have any responsibility to give me what I want? What Judaism teaches us is that a civilized society is based on fundamentally duty and personal responsibility. And once you have that structure, which gives you a responsibility for creating the circumstances in which other people flourish, then you have what we have now thought of as rights. But if you detach that from duty, then you don't have rights, you have demands. That's what the rights are, they're demands. And then you have the whole unraveling in a society that basically falls apart because it is run on the basis of individual demands, struggles for power between groups, and an erosion of communal bonds and social solidarity. So, and once we all understood that, but for various reasons, and it's a story that I allude to in the book, because it's such a central thing in the West, the human rights culture, and it arose out of the finest and most noble of instincts after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, in order to protect people who were vulnerable because their own governments were persecuting them. And so the idea, was established that what you needed was international tribunals and international law. But the problem with that is that if you don't have law that is anchored in a sovereign nation, in a sovereign nation governed by the consent of the people, which produces those laws, if you have kind of free-floating laws which are not anchored in any nation, it becomes immediately politicized. It becomes open to political manipulation. That's exactly what we've got. So the United Nations, for example, the idea that the United Nations stands for peace and justice is a sick joke. Much of the United Nations, as we've seen in the last terrible 15 months, is hand in glove with Hamas in the Middle East. It's done very little against tyrants. Its Human Rights Council, elevates tyrannies and dictatorships because the majority of the world is not democratic. The majority of the world does not adhere to the kind of standards of morality and political organization that we in the West do. So if you have a transnational body like the United Nations, which is composed of, basically virtually every sovereign nation in the world, you're not going to have an organization that is committed to the brotherhood of man. You're going to have an organization in which the most powerful suppress the weak. And that's what we've got. So all that needs to be unpicked. But
who are some of those? And that was eye-opening reading in your book. I never really thought of the UN in that way. I'm a bit of a layperson with regards to these wider geopolitical issues. And so to read about, I hadn't considered it. I think most people hadn't or haven't. The UN, it's just this sort of neutral organization. Exactly. But of course, as you point out, Iran and countries like that have just as much say as anybody else.
Yes, and not just as much say, but they muscle their way to the front of the queue, as it were. And the United Nations is institutionally not just hostile to, but determined to basically disempower the state of Israel. Its Human Rights Council is a most extraordinary record. I've forgotten now the precise figures, but it's a kind of handful of resolutions for the whole of the world, and hundreds of resolutions condemning Israel.
That's nice.
I mean, even if you think Israel is awful, I mean, the idea, that Iran and North Korea and Russia and Syria and all the kleptocracies of the world, are pale into insignificance beside the one democracy, and it's a human rights obsessed democracy, which is Israel. One democracy in the Middle East, which is Israel, is quite patently barking mad.
If you had somebody from the UN who was involved in that kind of decision making, what would you say to them? What do you think they might say?
Abolish yourself.
And what would they say? What would their response? I mean, their response wouldn't be yes, I will abolish myself. What would they say in defense of their absurd fixation on Israel?
I don't know what they would say about that specifically. I think they would sort of change the subject. They would say, but we're very concerned about human rights everywhere, and we're simply upholding human rights there. And then you would say to them, well, it's a disproportionate fixation, and they would I don't know what they would say, but they would never have the argument. They would never they would never have that discussion.
Yeah.
We would never get off the starting block.
It's absurd. And I know there'll be a percentage of people watching now who believe that Israel is awful, and I respect different opinions and things, but as you say, even if Israel is absolutely awful, it's absurd that it should have more resolutions than North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all of those countries together, multiplied by a huge factor. That's what it. So something's not right about the UN. I don't even know where to start with that. It's so frustrating, and I find it frustrating because people know that I'm Jewish. And I don't want to feel like I want them to think it's a fixation of mine or that I'm being biased. But I'd like to hear the other answer to that. I'd like to hear why that is. Something about it being Western, having different standards, I think, and that is, I think, part of the problem, isn't it?
Can I tell you a little anecdote which I've told millions of times before? So I apologise to your viewers that they've all heard it and they're going, oh, not this again. But to answer your question, an anecdote of when in 1982, when I was working for The Guardian, and I was a very different person then, and really wet behind the ears.
Lefty.
And what?
Big lefty.
Well, I thought I was a liberal, actually, but put that to one side.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought we're all marching under the same banner of justice and against abuses of power and betterment of humanity and conscience and all that kind of stuff. And I got very concerned. In 1982, Israel was in a really terrible war in Lebanon. It was completely stark. It was a controversial war by anyone's standards. But nevertheless, around the same time, President Assad, who is the father of the newly deposed President Assad, had caused to be killed between 10 and 40,000 of his political opponents over the course of, a couple of weeks. And I was very puzzled because this was, it was a news story on the foreign pages. It was quite a big news story, but it was just down the paper news story. Whereas, and nothing was said about it. Nobody cared about it. But every time Israel killed a few Palestinians in Lebanon, and they were killing them because they were trying to root out the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a major source of terrorism for Israel, but it was planted itself in Lebanon. So every time they killed a few Palestinians, there was uproar in the paper in terms of what it was printing. It was a front page story, this is what Israel's done, it's so aggressive, it's out of control. And then a furious leader, an editorial, and then incandescent op-eds. And I thought, why is there a double standard? And so I was then an editorial writer, and I asked my colleagues in the leader room, in the editorial room, why do we appear to have a double standard? And there was immediately a terrible silence, and I realized I crossed a line.
Oh.
I didn't know what I crossed. I didn't know why I'd crossed it, but everyone kind of looked. And then they said, well, of course we have a double standard, because we assume that you, and I realized in that instant, I stopped being we. I thought I was part of them, but I stopped being we and I become you. We, like you, are brought up to believe in certain things: human rights, respect for every individual. The developing world isn't brought up like that. They're brought up just to not to know those things at all. And Syria is part of the developing world. So we can't judge them by our standards. That would be racism. And I said, what are you telling me? That if one's born and bred in Syria or the developing world, one does not have the same rights to life and liberty that we do in the West? To me, that's racism. And that was the point. And that is, I hear this the whole time. It is the suspension of judgment of the developing world on the basis that they're not brought up to respect human rights, so we can't expect them to adhere to them.
But Israel should know better.
But Israel should know better, because we do you the great we do you the great honor of assuming that you are like us. And what's more, said my colleagues in that fateful exchange, you tell us you are more moral than us. And at that point I realized that the people I thought were on my side were absolutely on the other side. They were deeply anti-Semitic, they were anti-Jew, but they were also racist, because they believed that the developing world was not capable of the kind of moral principles that we were. Now, to me, being human, part of being human is to make moral distinctions, to make moral judgments. They were assuming that the developing world cannot be expected to make moral judgments. I mean, they were treating them as less than human.
So bigotry of low expectations, or what's the expression?
Absolutely. Soft bigotry of low expectations. Yes, but it was even worse than that. It's soft bigotry of low expectations.
But the hypocrisy here is that seems to be what is driving a lot of anti-Israel sentiment and a lot of anti-West sentiment in the press. At the same time, we're told that by them that there is no culture better or worse than another.
Right.
And that we should import hundreds of thousands of people from the cultures that are just as good as ours, even though we hold them to a different standard because of our soft bigotry of low expectations.
Right.
And it shouldn't have any effect or impact on our country.
Right.
This is bananas.
Well, yes, I think so. But I mean, this is the kind of iron wall one comes up against, because you can't get through that. You can't have the discussion about how stupid this is. Because why would it be stupid? They're people just like you and me.
They're in a cult. They're in a cult. Half the country's in a cult, it seems.
Well, it's not actually half the country. It's actually a minority, you see. But unfortunately, the minority hold absolute power. They run the entire culture. But, there are millions and millions of perfectly ordinary, decent people who really do get it. They may not think about it every day because they've got other things to think about. But they get it in their gut. They know they're living through a kind of madness. That's why they're all voting in the way that they're voting, for so-called populist politicians. Anybody who's not the establishment, which has led us down this terrible path.
Do you think there's something in the idea that the kind of person, in general, of course, who wants to become or has aspirations to be a politician, a human rights lawyer at the UN, a journalist, might be something of a box ticker? And very don't want to think outside of their box and will just continue the status quo?
I think it's much worse than that. If it was only box ticking, then one could sort of liberate them from the box. They really, really, really believe, and I know this because I was one of them once. They really believe that to be a progressive is to be on the moral high ground. Why? Because to be a progressive means you believe in things like the brotherhood of man. You believe in doing stuff to get rid of prejudice and war and bigotry, and you are anti-racist, and you believe in the power of reason. This is what you tell yourself. And consequently, anybody who comes along and says, well, actually, you're completely wrong, and far from actually ushering in an age of reason, you are ushering in an age of irrationality for these reasons. You support, the Palestinians, but in fact, this is what they are doing. They preach hatred and death to Jews the whole time. This is what you're supporting. So here's that evidence, or here is the evidence of anything that's against a left-wing ideology. And they will say, and I know this is how they think, they will say to themselves, they may say to themselves, I kind of thought that a bit because I can see this evidence. And I thought, can that be true? And then I realized that it's coming from people who are on the right, and therefore it cannot be true, because anybody who's on the right is against human flourishing, is a really bad person. They are not for the betterment of humanity. They're selfish. They are hidebound. They are reactionary. They are uneducated, whatever it is. And they're saying this. So it can't be true, because anybody who's not like me, who am a progressive person and therefore morally pure and virtuous and good and true, anyone who's not like me is basically anyone who's not like me is right-wing And anyone who's right-wing is bad and evil. Anyone who's bad and evil is right-wing. Anyone who's right-wing is bad and evil. And that's how it works. So you can't get through. There is no fact that you can produce.
In culture terms, they'd call it a thought-terminating cliche, where
oh, right.
Scientology would, rather than, I used to do a lot on Scientology, and that was my old podcast on the cults and things. Oh. And it was amazing to see those who have left, who say, gosh, if you spoke to me 10 years ago when I was in that cult, there was not a single thing you could have said.
Yes.
And they would say, this person is in Scientology, they say suppressive person, and it means anything they say is nonsense. So if they can sit there and prove to you that L. Ron Hubbard was a liar and Lord Xenu doesn't exist, and you would say, no, but you're a suppressive person. I won't even entertain your ideas.
Right. It's the same thing.
Must be ingrained into the human psyche in some sense.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And it's also, it's the sort of the herd mentality. They are in a bubble. All their social circle is in the same bubble, broadly speaking. I mean, there may be, differences. Someone's hard left, someone's soft left, someone is liberal, someone doesn't really understand or doesn't really know what they think, but they're all basically in the same ambit. They all have the same fundamental assumptions, and the most fundamental assumption is that anyone doesn't think like them, like the whole herd tells itself is what is true, or their opinion, is a bad person and cannot be trusted and cannot be believed. And so this is really terrifying, because this is what I mean by the complete eclipse of reason, rationality. These are people who make a fetish of being rational. And yet this is fundamentally, totally anti-reason.
I had a weird moment with a friend of mine who's a professor of literature, and he said to me, what was it? He'd been watching a bit of my stuff, or had an awareness of the podcast I'd been doing. And he said, just listen, go easy on the calling into question academia, because that's where fascism begins, because you're denying truth. When you start attacking academia, you're attacking truth. And I thought he was actually, even though he was a little bit more on the woke side than me, and I respect him a lot, I thought he was joking and sort of cosplaying at being one of these, everything's fascist. But I said, but surely, academia has done all it can over the last 20, 30 years to dismantle truth. So that's why I'm attacking academia.
Correct.
How frustrating is that? We can't get through to these people.
Correct.
They write articles and essays, dissertations about truth not being real, and then have a go at us if we criticize because we're attacking truth.
Yes.
Oh my God.
I know.
You also write in your book about the sexualization of kids as part of our civilization collapse. What's going on there?
All these issues are so big. I mean, we can really not really do justice to them. What's going on there is many things. It's at root the detachment of sexual activity from marriage and childbearing. All these things got separated out. And sex basically became a free-floating activity, which was completely desacralized. There was nothing significant in terms of spirituality, in terms of how you behaved, self-restraint and that kind of thing. It became almost imperative to realize, to fulfill your desire for pleasure and gratification. And so it became a thing in itself. And it became, as I say, desacralized, and it became quite a mechanical kind of thing, and a sort of instrument, an instrument of pleasure, in which you instrumentalized, therefore, other people. And so it all so when it came to children, it was Freud who said, you oppress sexuality in children, you oppress the child. He also said, if you unleash these sexual drives in an unrestrained way, the culture collapses. But that's what he was advocating. And so we don't see children anymore, generally. I'm generalizing, obviously, because millions of people do see children as they should be seen. But in general, we don't see children as needing parenting as needing guidance, as being immature and needing to be guided through life and protected from life, and developing in stages where some activities are appropriate and inappropriate, and then they become appropriate as the child gets older. We no longer see that. Why don't we see that? Because we've basically abolished parental duty, by which and I don't just mean parents, I mean also also teachers. We've told ourselves, for example, in education, we told ourselves decades ago that for a teacher to be a figure of authority and to impose a set of instructions on a child as to what to learn and how to learn was an assault on the child's autonomy. What the child brought to the education system was much more valid than anything the adult could do. And so the teacher had to take a back seat, and it was all led by the child. And similarly, in parenting, we were told that, the reason why so many people were so unhappy was that they had been repressed by their parents. They had been prevented from doing stuff because of ridiculous rules of behavior imposed upon them. And the authority of the parent, when it was used in that way, was itself an assault on the autonomy of the child. And the child basically, had to be freed from this. And parents believed this. I mean, I'm a boomer, baby boomer, and that's what we were all told. And we were all brought up, therefore, to believe, I say brought up in my sort of adolescence and early young personhood. We were all brought up to believe that we could do terrible damage to our children. We could basically, warp them forever by chastising them, by punishing them in any way, by restraining them, by giving them challenges they couldn't possibly meet, by expectations. And we were terrified that we would do them damage. And so we all kind of collectively stood back, and the boundaries just fell away. Now, a child needs boundaries. Otherwise, a child is unhappy. And the unhappiness takes many, many different forms. It can take the form of acting out in a bad kind of way, take the form of depression, going inward, just not doing very well at school, or whatever it is. But that's what we did. So we stopped viewing children through these and various other mechanisms that we inflicted upon ourselves. We stopped seeing children as they should be seen, as immature individuals who needed to be guided and given strong boundaries without which they would not flourish. And all these things came together. The detachment of sexuality from marriage and child rearing so that it became just a kind of recreational sport. And the viewing of children as kind of quasi-adults. I mean, this is why you had, the Jimmy Savile scandal. Jimmy Savile, who raped and abused untold numbers of young women and young girls. And you looked at these young girls and they were throwing themselves at him. We now read, and I remember at the time, and everybody went, well, that's what they do. I mean, if you're 14, I mean, they're having fun. They're having fun. And, then you scroll forward and you find sex education in schools, which is teaching young children, very young children, sometimes in primary school, about sexual, I would say fetishes, but sexual positioning, using, different orifices. I mean, to put it mildly, this is inappropriate. In my view, it's a form of child abuse. But it's all to do with this, we see sex now as a sort of just a thing to make us have a nice time. And we see children as basically quasi-adults who are entitled to the same rights to this as everybody else. And consequently, we have this grotesque sexualization of children, which in my view has meant that we have become effectively a society. We have tolerated and indeed endorsed the sexual abuse of children, which is kind of, and yet at the same time we become hysterical about. So work that one out. I mean, this is sickness. So I think it's a very important part of the decline of the West. And, I've lived through decades in which what I've just been saying has been, talk about being sneered at. You're regarded as a throwback to Victorian principles. You want to cover piano legs. You're such a ridiculous prude. Okay, fine. You're happy with what we're seeing? Are you? Among our young children, 13, 14, 15, dressing like prostitutes, throwing themselves at boys and men. This is, and we're all supposed to say nothing about this.
Not to labour the point, but that treatment of children as adults is also very common in cults, and it's a main principle of Scientology. It's a main the children, because it's believed there's a sort of adult soul inside them that gets passed on to the next person. So the kids are really brought up as though, and a lot of offences do happen of a sexual nature.
I see.
Because of that. So I see it everywhere now. Just this sort of mimicking of culture, which was once the niche, has now become this huge. It's the West now. What you explain, not with regards to children, but the family unit and things like that, it puts someone with my views in quite a bind, because I believe quite firmly in individual liberty, and I like the idea that, I'm married and I love it, but I don't think everyone should have to get married and everyone shouldn't have to do what I do and all of those things. And I don't like the idea that, maybe this kind of collective idea of like, these are the rules we live by and people should get married and should do. I don't like that. And yet it's impossible, I think, to deny the consequences of the life that I think everyone should have. There's a huge consequence.
Right. Well, I've struggled with this for a long time. When I started writing about this and got myself into no end of trouble about, the willed erasure of the traditional married family, and that was many decades ago. And I would write about it as a matter of public policy that I thought was disastrous. And I would get regularly, not just harangued, but people would kind of loom at me as if they were going to literally strangle me, and would say, "You are making me feel guilty. I am divorced." And I would say, "Well, I didn't even know you were divorced." What is this lunacy? And it's always this great tension between people, as individuals, and the society, how the society should be organized. And I think there is a terrible tension because, one wants people to live in a way that makes them happy and fulfilled. I don't wish to be censorious about individuals. People want to live in the way they want to live. That's fine by me. It should be nothing to do with me. But when it comes to public policy, and when you have a public policy which basically has eroded all the supports of a traditional married family and has either encouraged, winked at, or turned a blind eye to cohabitation, for example, cohabiting couples break up far more frequently than married couples. And the thing that really makes that rate of breakup accelerate enormously is when a child is born in a cohabiting household. So cohabitation has been an engine of mass fatherlessness. Now, fatherlessness is a serious blight, to put it mildly, because elective fatherlessness, by which I mean, it's different if the father is dead, has died. But if basically you're being brought up in a family where there is a matter of deliberate will, no father around, and you may not even know who the father was. Your mother may not know even who the father was because she's got you from a sperm bank. All the evidence has shown for decades that is a major force behind a whole range of social, personal, individual, and social problems. So it's best avoided if possible. And yet we've had a policy which has almost consciously, deliberately produced it. So, if I'm faced with a couple who is cohabiting, I have no problem with that. They live exactly as they want to live. It doesn't make any difference to me. I don't blame them. I don't hold them, I don't regard them as lesser people or anything. But if you have a public policy which has produced mass fatherlessness, then I do think that is appalling, because that is going to cause a significant amount of individual and social harm. And so what I would want is policy making that says, we're not going to force anybody to do anything or to live in the way that they don't want to live. But nevertheless, instead of basically saying, well, we don't care and let it all hang out and then have this terrible set of problems, we're going to encourage what we think produces the best outcomes for individuals and for society. And you can encourage it by various ways, through taxation, through just talking about it, through law. There are various ways you can do it. And all those engines of sort of cultural influence have been the other way, to produce a kind of social anarchy. And I'm saying that they should be directed to a more socially productive and individually productive way. That's all I'm saying.
Could it be argued that there might be a cause and correlation issue here, where the kind of father, let's say, who would rather cohabitate than marry is also the kind of father likely to run away when things get tough? And if cohabitation weren't on the,
maybe,
not available.
Maybe, but I mean the facts are as they are. When people get married, they stick together longer than if they cohabit, especially if they have children. So it's better to promote and encourage marriage than anything else.
Axel Rudakabana is now almost a household name in the UK. He was a Southport stabber who killed 3 children, stabbed many others as well. Why did Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, come out after that and say, he'd start blaming the far right?
Because the far right is responsible for all bad things in his universe. He is a human rights lawyer. Sorry, cheap point. But
a point nonetheless. There's something in that. This is sort of an ideological.
It's because people who were jumping up and down. I mean, let's scroll back. There were people who are very anti-Muslim, who immediately leapt to the wrong conclusion. They said he was a Muslim asylum seeker, which he isn't. We still don't know quite what he is, actually, but he's certainly not an asylum seeker. His parents were, Rwandan immigrants who, as far as I can see, are Christians. That doesn't mean it doesn't tell us anything about what he is, and we still don't know a lot about what he is. But there was then disturbances and riots, and again, it's this instinct that says, all these people are the far right. Now, some of those people, will look like, the typical shaven-headed louts that one associates with the far right. But a lot of them were not. They were just ordinary people who were enraged by what they saw as a double standard, as the government refusing to do anything about immigration, about Muslims, and so on. Now, some of that was inappropriate in those circumstances, but nevertheless they were quite ordinary people who were enraged by a general situation which they believed was being exemplified by this terrible atrocity in the Southport school. And so Keir Starmer's instinct, like so many on the progressive side of politics, is to say all those people are the far right, because that's the way you shut down the argument. There is nothing valid about what they're saying. There is no problem about immigration. There is no problem in the Muslim communities. There is no problem about anything that we think is beyond criticism. And that's why he reacted in that way. And that, of course, enraged people completely, because it kind of proved what they suspected. And then the truth of the matter and the facts of the matter became even more difficult to establish. And, the thing, I think, rhetorically, as well as on the streets, got completely out of hand.
Seems to me that there's also an element of using this as an excuse to shut down online commentary. He keeps referring to the online, the far-right hatred that's all swilling around the online, whatever that is. He said it was a new kind of terrorism, this. I mean, the internet's been around for 30 years.
Well, yes. Now, so this is a separate but related issue, which is another a form of mind-twisting denial that the progressive classes are going in for. As I say, we still don't know a lot about this man, Rudakabana. But we do know, well, what we've been told, is that he had a fixation with violence and had accrued a great deal of material to that end, including an Al-Qaeda manual, but also, other stuff, Nazi stuff and all kinds of stuff. And so now we're being told that he is a new kind of terrorist, which we should be very, very concerned about, which is the kind of a person who doesn't fit the definition of terrorism because you can't pin an ideology on him. He's not doing his violence for a cause, for a political cause. Now, we still don't know whether that's true, but let's assume it is true. Let's assume that, he's let's assume for the sake of argument, he is merely a very, very badly disturbed, psychologically disturbed individual with a fixation on violence, and that's why he did what he did. Let's assume that's true. He was referred to numerous authorities, and none of whom did anything about him. They just pushed him off. And that was a terrible, terrible failing. So we can park that as being, a sort of an object lesson in how not to deal with somebody who presents as clearly a growing threat. He had been reported at his school at having been involved in attacks. I mean, the warning lights should have been flashing and something should have been done. However, that is now being used to say quite falsely that that's the problem we should be worried about. So the problem that we think of as Islamic terrorism isn't the problem at all. The problem is people who aren't terrorists at all because they're kind of just driven by random violent, an attraction to random violence. So this is the problem we have to face. Well, no, that is a problem. I'm prepared to believe there are a number of people who fit into that. In other words, we have a number of people who are psychologically disturbed, and because of their psychological disturbance, they pose a threat, and they should be being dealt with by authorities, and they're not. I absolutely believe that is true. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a problem of Islamic terrorism, which is 80% of the security service / police counter-terrorism concerns are with individuals who are Islamic extremists and who they fear are going to become Islamic terrorists. 80%, maybe more. So what are they talking about? So they're using this man as another reason to say there's not a problem with Islamic terrorism. We don't have to talk about it. It's all being got up by the far right, and we can just sort of forget about it. Now, the thing we really got to be concerned about is people with, just undiagnosable, random, violent proclivities. So it's the same. It's just another means that they have another way they've seized upon to do what they've been doing for decades. And I don't just mean the Labour government, which is only recently become the government. I'm talking about the political establishment, including 14 years of Conservative government, and including the wretched Home Office, which is riddled with this kind of thinking, which has gone on for decades, which is to deny, because we're not going to go there. We're not going to look at that. And anyone who wants to look at that, being Islamic terrorism or Islamic extremism, is the far right. Because clearly there are far right people who are saying it. And consequently, everybody else is basically tarred, guilt by association. We're all the far right. And that's the way you silence it, because, there are serious social and professional consequences of being called the far right, put it mildly.
Yeah. It's one of
it's
the
a
worst
very
things
powerful
you can be
weapon.
called.
Pardon?
It's one of the worst things you can be called, apart from
Yeah.
that P word you used before for children, which I can't say too many times on YouTube. But being called a racist or far right is probably the next worst thing you can be called. I found it interesting as well. A lot of people were saying, "Oh, come on! It wasn't just that he had Islamic material; he also had Nazi and incel stuff." And I thought, well, but these aren't good things. It's not good
Exactly.
that we're not importing hundreds of thousands of Nazis to the country. Exactly. We're not importing hundreds of thousands of incels. The fact that these are all part of one thing shows there might be an issue we need to look at in
Exactly.
Islam. They saw that as okay, well, it's also Nazi stuff, so it's all fine.
Exactly.
Really odd.
It's being used to deny that is true in itself, but it's being used to deny something else which is bigger and more concerning.
You also you wrote about Prevent, which is the name of what is that exactly?
It's a counter-extremism program.
And they. You wrote of the percentages, because you just said before, I think 80% roughly,
something like that,
tend to be is Islamic terrorism, but they don't look at it.
That's correct. Well, there was a review by Sir William Shawcross in 2023 of Prevent. Prevent is a counter-extremism program, and when it was devised, the extremism that everyone was worried about was Islamic extremism, because it was the major source of terrorism in the country. And so Prevent was set up to kind of, literally prevent extremism by intervening with the people who were thought to be vulnerable to extremism and possibly terrorism. And what William Shawcross found in his review was that Prevent had basically been captured by the kind of thinking that I've just been talking about, so that Islamic extremism was completely downplayed, and what was being exaggerated was the threat from the far right, neo-Nazi groups like white supremacists. Now, I'm perfectly prepared to believe that, and as far as I can see, it is the case, that the far right neo-Nazi type people are a problem and a growing problem. I'm prepared to believe that. But the vast majority of the cases and the individuals being looked at by the security service are Islamic extremists. And yet Prevent was devoting virtually all of its attention to so-called neo-Nazis, or the so-called threat from the so-called far right. And now, so William Shawcross produced this report saying this. Now, the thing is this, that Shawcross had the most terrible struggle to get the Home Office to publish this. He was obstructed at every turn from within the Home Office, from within the counter-extremism units in the Home Office. And it was almost not published at all. And eventually he managed to get it published after a delay of many months, if not more than a year, I can't remember. And it was promptly buried. And now we can see there have been recent developments, recent developments in which, in the wake of the Southport disturbances and all those concerns, the Home Secretary told the Home Office to produce a report about all this. And they produced a report which was so inane in saying there is no problem with Islamic extremism, in downplaying it and upplaying everything else, that even the Home Office said, even the government said, rather, this is ridiculous. We completely reject this. And it turned out, we now read, that the Home Office units I've been talking about were behind this ridiculous report. So you've got, the ministry which is which is in charge of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, no longer even accepts what it is.
I presume, have we been infiltrated to an extent? I mean,
by Scientology, by
Scientologists, or by extreme Islamists. To what extent are they working? There must be some people in Prevent. I think I only say this, and I know I'm wary of even saying that, because it sounds like the conspiracy theories we say about Jews, for example, about anyone. But but I'm seeing this unfold, for example, on TV. I'm seeing Channel 4 just, I don't know about Prevent. I know about TV, though. I used to work in TV. I was told over and over as a white man I couldn't be on the screen anymore. And I was often rejected by people who had Arabic names. It's just something I've seen high up in production, Channel 4, who just released a documentary about Gaza, which I doubt will be two-sided. And as the Islamic population grows, look, I would be concerned if we had 4, 5, 6 million Hasidic Jews in this country, because I don't agree with everything in the Hasidic Jewish community. That's not to downplay everything in it, as I wouldn't downplay everything in the Islamic community. It's a number that is large enough, and we saw what happened in Lebanon. We saw in Iran what is happening now in Turkey, I think, Afghanistan, countries that were previously relatively secular, had some religion in them, had a bit of everything, that the population grew of Muslims, and it was, so without wanting to sound like a conspiracy theorist, are we at a point now where it's impossible to put the Jewish side forward, for example, or to put the non-Muslim side forward, because it's just, the numbers are too high?
Well, it's long been impossible to put the Jewish side forward. Going back many years, I've personally found that from my experience. It's certainly true that we see more and more Muslim names in the media. And, one should not generalize. There are many Muslims who, are horrified by extremism of any kind, and who are perfectly decent people who are signed up entirely to Western values and all the rest of it. However, there's a very significant proportion of that community which is not signed up to Western values, and an even larger proportion, I'm afraid to say, which really hates Jews. And that is a major, major issue which nobody talks about, nobody in the Jewish community talks about in public. So that is there, and it's self-evident that if those numbers are growing, then this problem is going to grow. However, what I'm, my own experience of the refusal to put the Jewish side, or the Israeli side, I should say, predates that. It's nothing to do with the Muslim community. It's white liberals. It's white progressives who really, really, really hate Israel because they have imbibed a narrative, if you can imbibe a narrative, which they believe to be axiomatically true. And anyone who says it's not true is, in this case, not right-wing, they're a Jew or they're a Zionist, which, for the purposes of this discussion, of that particular argument, is the same as saying they're a Nazi. It's like that. And these are white people, these are white progressives, and they've been like that for years. So, what you're saying, I'm sure, it's a point to consider, but it's not the main. It's not the main thing. The main thing, the main driver of this is white progressive society, which is embracing the fundamental anti-Semitism of the Muslim community, which is far, far more pervasive than in any other sector of society. They're embracing it because it plays to their own narrative, particularly since so much of it is to do with Israel. And now it's becoming more and more brazen in being anti-Jew. And so, the progressive world is having a bit of trouble with this because it's quite hard now to process that. But they are managing to process it because they're managing to wrestle it round to the narrative that to which they are entirely wedded, and which defines them as moral beings. This idea that the Israelis are fundamentally oppressive and aggressive, and the Palestinian Arabs are fundamentally their victims and only want good things like the rest of us, is so hardwired into progressive opinion that, in my view, it has produced a kind of moral deformation, a loss of moral compass, which goes far, far beyond the issues of the Middle East.
Bloody hell. I think, I mean, when we talk about the views in the Muslim community about Jews, in certain countries around the Middle East, I think it was Pew Research that found this, 97 to 99% of people have unfavorable views of Jews. So that's why I say that. I only repeat that now because I think people might go, what do you mean infiltrating? And I'd say to them, look, if you knew we were getting hundreds of thousands of people from countries where 97 to 99% of people have unfavorable views of your particular ethnicity, you might go, hang on, we better get out and do something.
Yeah. And of course, one can't talk about that because it's Islamophobic.
Yeah.
And we see, the government is flirting. They keep flirting and then they keep retreating under fire. But they're flirting with the idea of criminalizing Islamophobia.
It's insane.
Yeah.
This is it. I mean, it's all well and good to have these luxury beliefs about, don't say anything bad about it. When you start to feel, when you have empirical evidence that your family is no longer safe in your own home country, that's when you go, well, screw your PC culture, screw your wokeness. This is serious now.
Yeah. I mean, it's the Jews in Britain and elsewhere who are under guard, have to be under guard, and their schools are behind barbed wire, and their synagogue doors are reinforced. And they are the people, it's the Jews who are getting physically and verbally attacked all the time, to a degree, and intimidated. Now, there are people who hate Muslims, and there are people who hate Hindus and Sikhs, and people who hate anybody with a brown or black face. I mean, this is all terrible stuff, and this is true and real, and that's real prejudice. But, Islamophobia basically says that it's illegitimate to ascribe any misdeeds whatsoever to anyone or anything in the Islamic world. And so it's a complete chiller. It's a totalitarian invention, masquerading as an attempt to eradicate prejudice on a par with eradicating anti-Semitism. But the result is you cannot talk about Muslim anti-Semitism. And the Jewish community leadership in this country is silent on it. What it goes on and on and on about is the need to fight Islamophobia, which is the same as anti-Semitism. This is the Jewish community leadership.
Pathetic. Where can people get your book? What's it called, and where can they get it?
Okay, well, you can get it on Amazon. And it's called The Builder's Stone, How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It. Yes, it was published a couple of weeks ago. It was published in the middle of January. And I'm afraid you can't find it in bookshops for reasons of a technical kind to do with the way it was published. But you can certainly buy it on Amazon.
Okay, we'll have a link below, and I hope people will click on it. It's a wonderful. It's just changed so much of what I thought, which is what you want a book to do. Wonderful. Yes, with regards to, as I was saying before, the UN and understanding the mechanisms of it's insane. So people should read that book. Who's a heretic you admire? You. Go on, please go on. We have hours left. Continue. Okay. The heretic I admire enormously is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Who is so unbelievably brave, even braver than you. No, she is, bloody hell. I mean, really, she lives under armed guard the whole time, for the rest of her life. She came up through being indoctrinated as a Muslim, and indoctrinated to hate Jews. I was once on a platform, and the first time I saw her, we were sharing a platform. I'd never heard of her before. No, I had heard of her. I'd heard of her because she was already under death threats because of what she'd been doing against Islam and against the way they treat women. But I'd never met her before, and she took to the microphone. It was a Jewish meeting. I think it was in America. It was a Jewish organization that had us both speaking, and she took to the microphone and she said, "I'll never forget this." Without preliminary, she said, "I was brought up to hate you." She said, "I was brought up in Somalia. Every single thing that happened that was bad was your fault. There were no Jews in Somalia. But the water didn't come out of the taps, it was the Jews. Famine, it was the Jews. Illness, disease, it was the Jews." And this woman, she managed to get herself out of that mindset into a totally decent, civilized mindset. And she started fighting this totalitarian Islamic indoctrination that she knew was poisoning
half the world, more than half the world. And to cut a long story short, her activities were such that she has been under a severe death threat for many years, and she is continuing to speak and to campaign for great things. And I think she is so brave, and she's also right. You know, what she's saying is true and necessary and sane and sensible. So she is my heretic hero.
Yeah, she's one of mine as well, and that's why she's so hated, because she's so sane and sensible. A former guest on this show as well. It's wonderful. People, please do go and get Mel's book. It is just in the description. It changed how I think about everything. You have to go and get it just down there. Hit the like button and keep watching this channel.